Hey, what's going on, gang? This is Nate on the Stone. Welcome back to my channel. And this week we are taking the opportunity to talk about what the entire US is talking about. The killing of Qasem Soleimani. So just a little backstory in case anybody needs it. On December 27th, a US civilian contractor was killed and several US soldiers were wounded in a 30-plus missile attack on an Iraqi military base in Kirkuk. The attackers were a Shiite Muslim militia called Kataib Hezbollah, which is formally backed by Iran. In retaliation, the Trump administration bombed 3 Iraqi sites on December 29th, which are connected with Kataib Hezbollah, including weapon storage sites and command posts. In retaliation for those bombings, Kataib Hezbollah-backed protesters attacked the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad on New Year's Eve, occupying the secure green zone in the embassy, setting fires, and causing general destruction. Which leads us to the retaliation that everyone is talking about, which occurred on January 2nd, when a U.S. drone struck a Baghdad airport, killing Iranian commander Qasem Soleimani. Which is a really big deal because Soleimani wasn't just another terrorist leader like Osama bin Laden or Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the former caliph of ISIS. No, Soleimani was the commander of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' Quad Force, which is the foreign arm of the parallel military structure which Iran created after their 1979 revolution, and which reports directly to the supreme leader himself, which right now is the Ayatollah Khamenei. Being the commander of the Quad Force made Soleimani literally the number 2 man in Iran, who reported directly to the supreme leader himself, and thus Soleimani was an official member of the Iranian government, and not only that, but a really important part of that government. This has raised a howl of questions here in the West, including, was his killing legal? Was it prudent? What's going to happen next? Well, in this video, we are going to look at some of those questions, and we are going to answer a question that hasn't yet been asked. Question number 1, was killing Soleimani legal? Immediately after the news started flowing that Soleimani had bought the farm, a narrative started being wove on the left, which questioned the legality of the strike which took out Soleimani, because it was said that Trump had initiated and ordered this strike with the sole purpose of killing Soleimani without informing Congress or getting Congress's blessing. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said that the strike had happened without Trump consulting Congress and had happened without Congress actually authorizing military force against Soleimani or Iran. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer complained that the Gang of 8, that would be the top 4 leaders in Congress plus the 4 leading members of the Senate and House Intelligence Committees, had not been briefed about the strike before it happened. Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut tweeted this, quote, "Soleimani was an enemy of the United States. That's not a question. The question is this. As reports suggest, did America just assassinate without any congressional authorization the second most powerful person in Iran, knowingly setting off a potential massive regional war?" Congressman and former presidential candidate Eric Swalwell tweeted this. The U.S. airstrike that killed Iranian Major General Qasem Soleimani in Baghdad is a dramatic escalation of tensions in the region and a departure from our long-standing foreign policy practices, undertaken without any congressional notice or approval. All of this pearl-clutching that Trump didn't receive congressional authorization before whacking Soleimani off the map might be substantial if Trump had actually needed congressional authorization to do what he did, but the inconvenient fact is that he didn't. According to Scott Anderson, writing at the website Lawfare, executive lawyers have long maintained that, barring any specific legislation from Congress, Article 2 of the Constitution gives the president the authorization to use military force overseas if said military force satisfies 2 requirements. It is aligned with U.S. interests in the area, and 2, the operation is limited in nature and scope. Soleimani's death satisfies the first requirement, especially when you consider that he was the brains behind multiple attacks against the US over the last 20 years, including the December 27th rocket attack that got this whole ball rolling, as well as the attack on our Baghdad embassy on New Year's Eve. His Quds forces being the bridge between Iran and terrorist organizations like Kataib Hezbollah. Soleimani's death satisfies the second requirement too, because as Anderson says, a one-time drone strike without any civilian casualties or any substantial collateral damage does not equate with a substantial and prolonged military operation. In fact, one of the darkly ironic things about people like Schumer and Pelosi complaining that Trump did not receive congressional authorization before striking Soleimani is that for all the complaining that Congress is doing, Congress has done nothing. Read that again, absolutely nothing to change a situation that it claims it doesn't like. To quote Scott Anderson, "For its part, Congress has taken few steps to limit the president's Article 2 authority to use military force, nor is it entirely clear what limits it could constitutionally impose, given that the scope of the president's exclusive constitutional authority, which cannot be intruded upon by Congress, has not been settled by the courts." In other words, what's been happening is a jealous fighting over authority. Who has the authority to do what? Just as the framers of the Constitution intended the federal government to work, with Congress, the executive, and the courts vying for authority and thereby in the process keeping each other in check. And since these specific issues haven't been hammered out, all of these dark hints or dark mutterings that the president didn't receive congressional authority before striking Soleimani, they're just the bellowings of empty barrels designed specifically to push a narrative. Now, in all honesty, it is true, as Anderson points out, Congress has enacted more robust reporting requirements on the executive when it comes to special military operations that have as their goal the capture or the killing of specific individuals. So you might think that Soleimani's death doesn't cut the mustard, at the very least in this regard. But we run into another inconvenient fact. The reporting requirements for sensitive military operations specifically excludes military operations taken in Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq. Much like the separation of children from adults at the southern border, this is something that Congress could take steps to actually remedy if it thinks that there is a problem, or if it thinks that there is potential for abuse in this area. The fact that it hasn't makes it seem very much that it's not so much that the executive did not receive congressional blessing to take out a terrorist like Soleimani. No, the problem is who was in the executive when Soleimani was taken out. Question 2. Was it prudent? So here's the thing about Qasem Soleimani being the head of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' Quad Force. The guy was a terrorist, like I called him before, and not just because last year the Trump administration designated the IRGC as a foreign terrorist organization. No, as the commander of the Quds Force, Soleimani was the mastermind behind numerous attacks against us and our interests in the Middle East. For example, Soleimani was responsible for the creation of explosively made penetrators, a particularly vicious form of IED, which Iran shipped to Iraqi terrorist groups during the Iraqi War that caused the deaths of 600 American soldiers between 2005 and 2007. Soleimani and his Quds forces backed terrorist organizations in the Middle East, like Kataib Hezbollah, as well as Middle Eastern strongmen, like Bashar Assad of Syria. Also, incidentally, Soleimani was responsible for his Quds forces planning terrorist attacks in European countries, like the Quad plot that was uncovered in Germany a few years ago. In 2011, Soleimani was the brains behind a planned terrorist attack that would have bombed the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. for the express purpose of killing Saudi ambassador Adel al-Jaber. In 2012, Soleimani was directly involved in the planning of the attack on the U.S. Embassy in Benghazi, the infamous Benghazi attack that killed 4 Americans. And Soleimani has been responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Iranians himself, Iranian dissenters who protested the Ayatollah's reign. Obviously a bad dude, to put it mildly. But here's the question. The world is full of bad people. Was it prudent to take out this particular bad guy in this particular way at this particular moment? Especially when you remember, like we've said before here on the stone, for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. And the reaction to Soleimani's death can already be seen to be brewing. You can see it in crowds of people marching in memory to Shiite Islam's new martyr in Iraq, Iran, even as far away as India. You can hear it in the promise from the top brass of Iran's government for swift and terrible retribution. You can see it in the Iraqi parliament voting to kick US forces out. And just to add a cherry on top of all this good news, to paraphrase the church father Tertullian, the blood of martyrs is the life force of movements, meaning that the repercussions from the death of this newest Islamic martyr could very well be severe and terrible. But we have to weigh all of those facts against this one. If Soleimani had not been taken out when he was, he would still be alive today to plan and initiate attacks not just against US interests in the Middle East, but against everyone in the Middle East who stood opposed to Iran's Islamic Revolution. In fact, according to the US State Department, Soleimani was already planning additional and imminent attacks against US interests in the area when the drone offed him. If he hadn't been taken out, or if our reaction to the New Year's Eve attack on the Baghdad embassy had just been our usual one, maybe more bombings on either pro-Iranian, pro-Hezbollah sites, chances are Soleimani and the Iranians just would have been more emboldened to continue their proxy war against the US. Either way, with Soleimani dead or Soleimani alive, the situation in the Middle East was more than likely just going to continue to deteriorate, to become more deadly and more violent. And given that dichotomy, making Soleimani cash in his chips when we did was the prudential thing to do. It was the least bad option in an entire sea of them. Now, I'm not going to sugarcoat things, gang. It's very possible that Soleimani's death has set off a chain reaction that will bring about a war with Iran. I'm not going to sit here and say, as I've read others do, that Soleimani's death actually reveals the weakness of the Iranian regime. No, I'm not going to do that. But we have been in a shadow war with Iran for decades, going all the way back to the 1950s. And that shadow war was going to continue regardless of what we did. And if it comes to war for my money, I'll always prefer an open war than a proxy war, a shadow war, a war by any other name. But, there is a third option, people will say. The United States could just leave the Middle East. Wash our hands, pack our bags, and leave the whole godforsaken mess to the people who actually live there. And they're right, that is definitely a third option. Which brings us to the third question, and the question that no one else has asked yet, which is, should we defend the American empire? At this point, you might be throwing up your hands thinking, okay, Nate's lost it. He's cracked. He's gone nuts at last. What is this with this empire jazz? America isn't an empire, it's a representative republic. Regardless of the gnashing and hysterics from the left, we don't have an emperor. We don't have colonies. We don't have conquering armies. What are you smoking, man? And that's true to a certain point, but that's too shallow of a definition of empire. An empire isn't just a geopolitical entity that is arbitrarily bigger than a kingdom. If that was true, then the only thing in common that empires across the world and across time would have in common would be an arbitrary size. And of course, there has to be more to it than that. The ancient Roman statesman and philosopher Cicero had a much better and deeper understanding of what an empire is. Cicero defined an empire as a system of power, imperium, that was united towards certain ideals, built upon a religious and/or judicial foundation. The exercise of this power created what Cicero called a patrocinium, a commonwealth, which was united in interests and in power. And power for Cicero did not simply mean political or military power. It also meant artistic power and the power of knowledge, i.e. of learning. Empire, in other words, then, was the nucleus of the civilized world. It was the center of art, learning, knowledge, and yes, political and military power. With this definition, the US can't be anything but an empire. For example, we are the center of art in the world. Look at Hollywood. We are, for better or worse, the center of learning. Look at how many people around the world who want to send their kids to an American university to get an American education. Furthermore, as the world's, right now, lone superpower, the United States is the center of political and military power in the world. And we have exercised this power, exporting American movies and American education and American ideas, good and bad, around the world. Furthermore, when it comes to politics and military, we have propped up certain regimes and toppled others. This was especially true in the 20th century, especially after World War II, when the US was attempting to check the Soviet Union's expansion in the world. This is actually, ironically now, how we became involved and so entrenched in South America and in the Middle East to begin with. And it's how the Pax Americana was created in the first place after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989. Just because this American empire exists, just because it was forged, particularly in the second half of the 20th century, does not necessarily mean that it's a good thing. And it might be better off for everyone involved, the world and the US, if we just, as Americans, washed our hands of empire, brought everyone back home, and worked to fix the myriad of problems that we have here within our own borders. I'm not going to lie, it is a very tempting thought, but it has its own problems too. One of the laws of history seems to be that there always has to be an empire. There always has to be a nucleus of power in the world, with every time period having its own empire, whether it's the Egyptian Empire, the Persian Empire, Alexander's Empire, the Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, the Napoleonic Empire, the British Empire. The list goes on and on and on. And because, as we've mentioned before here on the channel, nature abhors a vacuum, if we give up this American empire, the void that we create in giving it all up is going to be filled up again. And it won't be the British or the French, a country that actually shares some of our Western principles. No, it will be an emerging country like, say, China, which has global ambitions of its own and which has been very enthusiastically and energetically working to make those global ambitions a reality, which has included, coincidentally, becoming very chummy with a Middle Eastern country whose name begins with an I and has Iran in it. We can lament that decades of past decisions have turned the United States into an empire, whether we actually call ourselves that or not. We can lament the blood, sweat, and treasure that it has taken to preserve that empire and that it continues to take to preserve it. But none of that changes the fact that we do have this empire, and that for as evil, rotten, and corrupt as our leaders can be, and as evil, rotten, insane, and immoral as our culture can be, and which it continues to become worse and worse, we are still light years better than the regime that still has re-education camps for dissenters and for religious minorities. Yes, all empires crumble, there are no exceptions. But just because that's the truth, that doesn't mean that we can raise the white flag, wash our hands of the whole thing, and just come home early. No. Shakespeare wrote in his play Twelfth Night that some men are born great, others attain greatness, and others have greatness thrust upon them. The thing is, the responsibilities are exactly the same, no matter which of the three paths is taken. But will Americans, you and me, have the resolve, the determination, the steel, and the brass to actually defend what has been left to us? Will we be able to defend the American empire? Especially in a culture that encourages softness, dependency, and atomistic individualism. Can it even exist when the spiritual beliefs that sustained the West for centuries rot now in a vat of moral therapeutic deism? That's the $64 question, and honestly, I wish I had an answer for you all, gang, but Right now, at this moment, sitting here in this chair on the stone, I don't. What I do know and what I can say right now is that ultimately the fate of the American empire will depend on the strength of the American people. And that strength depends on the individual strength of each man, woman, and child here in the United States. I can also say that if that strength fails us, and if the empire collapses, and if that void is filled by something else, it's not going to be good for anybody. But always, what say you? Do we have a responsibility, not just to ourselves, but to the world, to preserve the American empire? Or would everyone just be better if we disassembled it as quickly as possible? As always, let me know your thoughts, ideas, and opinions in the comments section below. Well, that about wraps up everything for right now, gang. As always, if you liked the video, whether you agreed with me or not, don't forget to show your support by giving it a like, leaving it a comment, and sharing it with your friends. And if you like videos about the culture, politics, and religion, but from a different POV, then think about subscribing to the channel and ringing that bell for notifications so you'll always know when I post new videos like this every Tuesday. Videos you're not going to want to miss. As always, thank you for watching, for giving me a little bit of your day. Thank you to everyone who has already subscribed to my channel. I appreciate you all. And I will see you again here next week, gang, on top of the stone. Ciao.